The author of this next book is probably best known for a work he put out, I think is maybe in the 80s or late 70s, called Orientalism. Um, and that really launched his sort of more popular career, and a lot of debates within academia about how the West talks about um, people in other parts of the world. That man's name is Edward Said. That's not the book I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about one of his lesser-known books, but that is the context for which he's most known, I guess, among more popular audiences. This book is an interesting one. It's called Representations of the Intellectual by Edward W. Said, and this is a compilation of 6 wreath lectures that Said delivered over BBC Radio in 1993. And the title is a little bit misleading, I thought. Said doesn't really examine representations of intellectuals so much as he offers a prescriptive way he thinks they should function within a society. Maybe that's kind of the same thing, I don't know. His particular interest is the intellectual in the late 20th century, confronted as they are sometimes on all fronts with ideological and increasingly political concerns. How is the intellectual to align himself or herself with these, or should they? That's one of the driving questions behind the book. The title essay for me was the most interesting, drawing a sharp distinction between the conception of the intellectual developed by the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci and the French intellectual Julien Benda. Gramsci himself discerns between 2 types of intellectuals. Traditional intellectuals are the, quote, teachers, priests, and administrators who continue to do the same thing from generation to generation, while organic intellectuals are directly connected to classes or enterprises. Again, classes, Gramsci is a Marxist, that use intellectuals to organize interests, gain more power, and get more control. Gramsci thought that everyone has the potential to be an intellectual, even if some do not function as intellectuals in society. So he had a much more radically democratic idea of what an intellectual could be in a society. In his 1927 essay, The Betrayal of the Intellectuals, Julien Benda's decidedly less demotic, or even Platonic ideal of the intellectual suggests that they are a tiny band of super-gifted and morally endowed philosopher kings who constitute the conscience of mankind. Benda thought intellectuals had largely given up the objective, dispassionate analysis of issues and had become corrupted by special interests, politics, and vulgar nationalism. Said uses Gramsci and Benda as touchstones throughout the essays for what he thinks the intellectual should and shouldn't strive toward and strive for. The rest of the essays revolve around a small number of reoccurring themes. The intellectual, for example, should always wear the mantle of the exile, if not literally, then at least figuratively. He should be an outsider, a figure who is always proffering contrary, oppositional viewpoints. Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski are 2 such figures, even though Said displays sublime self-control in not pointing out that they actually use their intellectual firepower to further the hegemonic interests of the most powerful nation in the world. Said also favors the approach of the amateur over the professional. The professional is epitomized by the, as he says, impossible to understand classroom technician hired by committee, anxious to please various patrons and bristling with academic credentials, and a social authority that does not promote debate, but established reputations and intimidates non-experts. Instead, the amateur, literally one spurred on by care and affection, works outside, or at least in addition to his own narrow specializations, in an effort to understand matters in a broader context. This is a solid foundation, but left a lot of important questions completely unconsidered, I think. What about those intellectuals, for example, who do align themselves with avowed political concerns? What about Noam Chomsky's endorsement of anarcho-syndicalism and continued skepticism regarding many American foreign policy decisions? Do those mean that he can't be considered an intellectual? Apparently not, as Said refers to him approvingly at least once during the course of the lectures. And while the scope of a set of 6 lectures, each originally a radio address with a duration of about 30 minutes, is almost necessarily narrow, the essays don't address the dynamic change in the role of the intellectual over the centuries. While Said's ideal of the intellectual is almost necessarily a public one, such a thing would have never existed, for example, in medieval Europe. Would the fact that a number of medieval clerisy was almost always a member of the church change anything here? Or that the Renaissance artist was always beholden to a wealthy Maecenas, whether religious or secular? I realize that these questions are largely beyond the scope of his project here, but I found myself wishing for a longer book-length treatment as opposed to a collection of essays to address these in a more thoughtful, more developed way. Most of the material here is a pretty cautious appraisal and a non-controversial précis of what's been said about intellectuals by others. The intellectual should excuse the cliche, speak truth to power, shouldn't be the tool of political or ideological interests, and should eschew narrow professionalism. Having read Said's Orientalism and another collection of his on late style, which was put together after he passed away about 10 years ago, both of those are very innovative and thought-provoking collections. I found these essays to be pretty conservative in this book. For the most part, the intellectual as exile, as someone not deeply beholden to really entrenched ideological or political interests, and as the intellectual as passionate amateur, are not new. Reading Said always leaves me wanting the wild-eyed radical that he's so often accused of being by predominant American neoconservatives, but in this case I was left with something much more pragmatic and, as I said, altogether cautious, but still a very interesting book with some worthwhile ideas in it. Edward Said's Representations of the Intellectual.